Welcome, scholars, to Lesson 1-4.5, Economics of the Plague. I want to begin this lesson by quickly just discussing the point that the plague was this horrible, horrible event. But today we're mostly going to be talking about some good things that came out of it. So I don't want to lessen our conversation about the fact that the plague was really a catastrophic loss. I mean, population loss due to the Black Death is unmatched in history. Nothing was as catastrophic as this plague was. And that includes some pretty horrendous things that have happened in history. But when we look at the total global population loss, we're looking at 200 million people, almost as high as 200 million people. That is unfathomable. That is, it's a tremendous loss. Nothing compares. I'm stretching my mind to think of anything that would even come close, and I can't even come up with anything that would come close. It hit Europe especially hard, with about 50% of Europeans dying of the plague, as we've discussed, and all those deaths happening in about a 4-year stretch of time. Also, if we blow this up and look at the big picture, we are talking about 1 in 5 people on Earth. 20% of the population of Earth died from the Black Death. This includes, the people living in North and South America who had absolutely no exposure whatsoever to this. This includes people in sub-Saharan Africa that had virtually no exposure to this. This was just, it hit India, it hit China, it hit Europe really hard, and those were where the major population centers were. And it was just this absolute catastrophic loss. But there were some positives. We're going to sidestep here and talk about economics for a moment. See, following the plague, manors lose half of their workforce. So if you had 100 serfs before, now on average you've got 50. But they didn't lose any of their other production. They didn't lose their fields. They didn't lose their buildings, their mills, their smithies. They didn't lose any of that other stuff. They lost people. So in economic terms, the supply of land was very high, and the availability of labor was very low. I'm going to direct your attention now to this supply-demand curve that we see here. These blue lines represent supply. And if we move to the right along this line, this is the quantity of supply. This here is demand, which is going to remain fixed at this point. We're not talking about a shift in demand, we're talking about a shift in supply. Now on this curve, we see that as supply increases, that is the same point on this line, moves further along this axis, that is, supply is increasing, demand is decreasing. The point at which the two meet is price. So when you've got a supply, of here and a demand of here, this is the cost of labor. This is how much an individual can charge. Over here, we have an increase in supply, decrease in the price that labor can charge. Well, what we see happening in the Black Death is a dramatic decrease in supply. It moves our line from over here, way over here, where our new point would be up here. Less supply of labor, demand being more or less fixed. It wasn't, but I'm simplifying. And we wind up with an increased cost of labor. That is, the serfs could get a better deal. And in the Middle Ages, what this meant was the serfs could farm more land than they ever could before, and they would pay less in rent for that. So they would work really hard, but they would get a lot more of their returns back for their own personal income. This is going to be really essential for the increased livelihood of serfs. It becomes a lot less bad to be a serf. Not to say that it's great, but the serfs have a lot more economic opportunity. This new economic reality meant that in many manners, the serfs were able to acquire wealth and eventually purchase their freedom. Because remember, serfdom it's a form of slavery. But these serfs could work, could earn a living on top of their duties, their duties to their lord, and earn a small income. After the Black Death, that small income becomes a medium or even a large size income, and they purchase their freedom, increasing the number of freedmen. So we have a lot more people who are not bound to serfdom, but they're also not within the feudal system. They're kind of outside of that whole feudal hierarchy. And that's going to have a lot of positive influences on Europe as a whole. Serfdom, it is important to note, does continue to exist for over 500 years. It doesn't disappear after the Black Death, although it does in one or two places. But for the most part, serfdom is going to continue to exist in different areas of the world for about 500 years following the Black Death. But there are also a lot more freedmen. And those freedmen are going to demand rights and privileges and take a share of the wealth from the aristocracy, from the nobles. So feudalism as a system is going to decline. Some would argue that it was already in a marginal decline prior to the Black Death, and this may or may not be true, but there's no historian out there who would argue that feudalism was not in more or less a free fall following the Black Death. You can trace a direct line from the Black Death to the end of the feudal system in most countries. This is because the freemen are acquiring ever larger amounts of wealth, larger amounts of land. By the 1500s, we see that freemen are wealthier than minor lords in many, many countries. We see this true in England, Scotland. We see this true in France. We see this true in the Holy Roman Empire, that freemen are starting to do very, very well for themselves. And this is going to hurt that whole feudal system because if you notice, we don't have freemen in this whole hierarchy. It's the serfs that finance the knights, that finance the vassals, that finance the lord, with the resources going up the chain. Once you've got fewer serfs, that's fewer resources moving up the chain. And eventually the lords, the kings, are going to figure out alternative ways to maintain their wealth and maintain their power and prestige. But that's going to have to be outside of this feudal system. Additionally, increasingly, they're going to start relying on merchants for their wealth. And merchants are not within this feudal hierarchy. Now, this is not an overnight occurrence by any stretch of the imagination. The process of granting rights to this new middle class, these freedmen who are acquiring skills and land and wealth, does not happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen at the same pace everywhere. We do see very quickly in Scotland, serfdom was abolished. But the Scots had always had this kind of fierce, independent character to themselves. So it's not that surprising to see that the Scots were kind of the first to throw it off. But England throws off serfdom shortly after. But then we see this lag between England and France, for example. France won't officially outlaw the feudal system and serfdom until 1789. It has declined in popularity and in strength in many ways through the 1600s and 1700s, but it still exists until 1789, and it exists in Russia all the way up until 1861, so the time of the American Civil War. We still have serfs. These are photographs of actual Russian serfs, because photography existed in the 1680s. So we're not looking at just artwork here. We're looking at photographs of Russian serfs out in the fields, working really hard. And most of their work is going to go up to their feudal lord. Serfdom was kind of alive and well in some places. But as we start to see Scotland, England, Wales, and then onto the mainland and the Netherlands, and it goes on and on and on. People start to see the advantages of getting rid of serfdom and the feudal system. And this really does remake Europe. And it's a reason for the success of Europe later on. This introduction of a wealthy, prosperous middle class people who are not aristocrats. They're not nobles. They're not from those privileged families, but they're able to increase their wealth through their own sweat and hard work. It really helps the national economy. It gives people more incentive to work than they'd ever had before, and they come up with new ideas, and they're not limited on who their family is. And people don't assume that they can't accomplish great things just because they don't have a title. As these ideas start to shed, the nations that drop them first really are the first to truly benefit. We mentioned Scotland and England, and Scotland and England are going to be the first two places where we see the Industrial Revolution. We're quite a ways off of that, but like it leads toward those sorts of innovations. Nations which made those positive steps were just pretty soon outpacing others. This is where England and Scotland, a little bit later, will start to arise as continental powers, and it just really starts to show the benefits of a strong, thriving middle class. Now, this does not mean that it happens everywhere. And while people see the benefits of it for a nation as a whole, we wind up having a lot of wealth within the nobility resisting that change. Because in order for the middle class to benefit and really thrive, that's going to be at the expense of the old noble families who have their wealth in land worked by serfs. As soon as they have to start paying those employees more, their income goes down. And therefore, a lot of those wealthy landed nobility resist this change. That's particularly why we see the delay in France. It was the wealthy nobles not wanting to give up their privileged positions. And that slows the abolition of serfdom in some places, but it does eventually collapse. And serfdom no longer exists anywhere in the world today, although as a side note, it did exist in the little country of Bhutan until the 1950s, but this is not in Europe and not really a part of our discussion, but serfdom was still around until 60 years ago. Anyway, hope you enjoyed this lesson. I'll see you in class.